San Francisco airport was full of life. The loudspeakers announced flight departures and arrivals, while passengers hurried through the terminals. Amidst this human tide, a 7-year-old girl stood out. Emily, with her blonde hair and curious eyes, clung to the hand of a man who appeared to be her father. He, with a serious and distant demeanor, did not take his eyes off his phone, completely ignoring the little girl who was trying to get his attention. Emily looked around with wide eyes, trying to absorb every detail of the bustling airport. It was a fascinating and terrifying place for a girl her age. The rolling suitcases, the constant announcements, and the incessant flow of people produced a mix of excitement and fear in her. She tried several times to attract the man's attention, but he only murmured brief responses without looking away from the screen. Meanwhile, in a corner of the airport, an older man with a scruffy beard and worn clothes observed the scene. David, a vagabond who had spent months on the street, had finally saved enough money for a plane ticket to take him back home. His tired but alert eyes caught the image of the girl and her companion. Something in Emily's gaze seemed unsettling to him. David headed to the check-in counter, his wrinkled ticket in hand. The airport employee looked at him with distrust, but completed the process without comments. Upon receiving his boarding pass, David felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Arriving at the boarding gate, David sat in the last available seat, watching the line of passengers move slowly. Among them he recognized the girl and the man. Emily continued to cling to his hand, looking around nervously. David felt a pang of empathy. He knew what it felt like to be helpless and alone. Boarding continued, and David was among the last to board. He found his seat at the back of the plane, right next to the bathroom. He sank into the seat, looking out the window while the cabin crew closed the doors and prepared for takeoff. His gaze kept returning to the girl, now seated several rows in front of him. As the plane began to taxi, David tried to relax, but his mind kept returning to the girl. Something about her expression deeply troubled him. During the ascent, David watched as Emily looked out the window, with a mix of awe and fear. Her companion remained absorbed in his phone, completely ignoring her. David, with years of experience on the streets, knew how to recognize when someone needed help. And Emily, despite being accompanied, was clearly in distress. His instinct told him something was wrong. The engines roared as the aircraft climbed into the sky, leaving behind the bustle of the terminal. Passengers settled into their seats, some closing their eyes to relax, others looking out the windows with fascination. Among them, David observed his surroundings, trying to calm himself amidst the commotion of the flight. From his seat at the back, David noticed the girl he had seen earlier at the airport. Emily, with her blonde hair tied in 2 braids, seemed uneasy. Her eyes, which had been full of curiosity, now reflected a mix of anxiety and fear. She looked around desperately, as if searching for someone who could help her. David frowned, feeling a pang of concern. It was obvious that something was wrong with the little girl. He watched as the man next to her, with a severe expression, continued to be engrossed in his phone, completely indifferent to Emily's distress. The girl began to shift uncomfortably in her seat, whispering something that David couldn't hear from a distance. He couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something about the situation that didn't add up, and his instinct told him he needed to do something. Cautiously, David unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, pretending to stretch as he walked down the aisle. He approached the row where Emily was sitting and leaned slightly to get her attention. "Hi, are you okay?" he asked softly, trying not to scare her. Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with restrained tears. She hesitated for a moment before grabbing David's jacket sleeve and whispering in his ear. "I'm scared. I don't want to be here," she said in a trembling voice. Before David could respond, the man next to her lifted his head from his phone and frowned upon seeing them talking. With a brusque movement, he grabbed Emily by the arm and dragged her back to her seat. "Stop bothering people, Emily," he said sternly, looking at David with disdain. "She's fine, just a little nervous about the flight." David raised his hands in a peace gesture and took a step back, but his concern did not diminish. He returned to his seat, but his thoughts stayed with the girl. Something about her behavior and the way the man treated her suggested that there was more to this story than met the eye. As the plane continued its ascent and reached cruising altitude, David couldn't stop thinking about Emily. He looked around the plane, searching for a flight attendant who could intervene, but they all seemed busy with their tasks. Determined not to ignore what he had seen, David got up again, this time with a clearer plan in mind. He walked to the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were organizing meals and drinks. "Excuse me," David said to one of the attendants, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile. "I think something is wrong with that girl over there. She is very scared, and the man with her doesn't seem concerned." The flight attendant followed David's gaze to where Emily was sitting. She observed for a moment before nodding. "I'll talk to them. Thank you for letting me know," she replied. David returned to his seat, feeling a slight sense of relief. He knew there wasn't much more he could do, but at least someone from the crew was now aware. As he settled back into his seat, he saw the flight attendant approach Emily and the man. There was a brief conversation, but the man shook his head, and the attendant left after a few minutes. David sighed, frustrated by the lack of action. He knew he couldn't force the situation, but the unease remained in his mind. He decided to stay vigilant, ready to intervene if things worsened. The flight continued, and although the sky outside the plane was calm, inside David, a storm of worry and determination was beginning to form. He would not allow anything bad to happen to Emily without doing everything possible to help her. As the plane headed towards New York, David mentally prepared for any eventuality, knowing he had to be ready to act at any moment. The flight remained stable as passengers began to relax in their seats. The soft lights of the plane created a tranquil atmosphere, but for David, the unease grew. Every movement of the girl was scrutinized with attention. Emily seemed more nervous than before, her eyes darting from side to side and her hands fidgeting with the straps of her dress. Suddenly, David saw something that alarmed him. Emily was making a gesture with her hands, a subtle but clearly intentional movement. He had seen that type of signal before, on the streets, where silent communication was often a matter of survival. David realized the girl was trying to say something, and it wasn't just simple anxiety about flying. It was a cry for help. David got up again, this time determined to take action. He walked down the aisle towards the front of the plane, where a flight attendant was serving drinks. He stopped next to her and spoke in a low but urgent voice. "Excuse me, I need to talk to you about a passenger," he said, trying to keep calm in his voice. "That girl, Emily, I think she is in danger. She is making distress signals with her hands." The flight attendant, a young woman with a tired expression, looked at David with distrust. She glanced quickly towards the row where Emily was sitting, but didn't seem to give much importance to his words. "Sir, we have many nervous flyers. I'm sure the girl is just scared. Her companion doesn't seem worried," she replied, diplomatically. David felt frustration burn inside him. He knew his appearance didn't help him. As a homeless man, he was used to being ignored and underestimated. But he couldn't let that stop him now. "Please, take a closer look at her. It's more than just anxiety. I'm certain she's in danger," he urged urgently, his voice tinged with concern. The attendant, a bit distracted but sensing his seriousness, sighed softly and nodded before moving on to attend to other passengers. David sank back into his seat, a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily needed help, and he was determined to find a way to reach her. With a shaky hand, he retrieved a pen and a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Carefully, he wrote a brief but direct message. "Do you need help?" Glancing around discreetly to ensure no one was watching, he rose from his seat and walked purposefully towards Emily's row. As he approached, he caught her eye briefly before deftly slipping the note into her lap as if passing by innocuously. Emily, startled, glanced down at the note and then back at David. Her eyes reflected a mix of fear and relief as she quickly folded the paper and concealed it in her hand. Their eyes met briefly, and with a barely perceptible nod, Emily silently confirmed his suspicions. David's heart raced. He knew he had to act quickly. This was a critical moment, and Emily's safety depended on his next move. He returned to his seat, his mind working frantically to devise a plan. He knew he couldn't rely on the crew to take his concerns seriously. He had to find a way to protect Emily until they could land in New York. David decided to stay close to the girl, watching every move of the man accompanying her. His cold and distant look did not inspire confidence. There was something dark about his behavior, something David couldn't identify, but made him more determined to intervene. The flight continued, and David mentally prepared for whatever was necessary. He knew that once on the ground, he could alert the authorities. But until then, he had to ensure Emily was safe. The responsibility weighed on his shoulders, and the determination in his eyes grew with each passing minute. David took another piece of paper and wrote, "Stay calm. I am here to help you." He passed it to Emily at an opportune moment. She read it and nodded again, clutching the paper to her chest like a talisman of hope. The tension in the air was palpable. Every second stretched out as David and Emily exchanged looks filled with understanding and fear. The man accompanying her remained oblivious to this silent connection, absorbed in his own world. David couldn't get the image of Emily nodding out of his head, confirming she was in danger. His instincts screamed that he had to act quickly and discreetly. He knew that if the man accompanying her realized his intentions, it could make the situation worse. He had to find a way to alert the crew without raising suspicions. He took a moment to calm down and think of a plan. He knew he had to approach the cockpit door without attracting attention. He got up from his seat and walked slowly towards the front of the plane, pretending to stretch and look out the window. As he passed the row where Emily was, he gave her a reassuring look. When he reached the cockpit door, he stopped and waited for a flight attendant to pass by. He called her discreetly. "Excuse me, I need to speak with the pilot. It's an emergency," he said in a low voice, trying to keep calm. The attendant looked at him with surprise and some distrust, but nodded and approached the cockpit door. She knocked softly, and the door opened slightly. She whispered something to the pilot, who nodded and gestured for David to enter. Inside the cockpit, the noise of the engines was louder. David felt a bit intimidated, but knew he had to maintain his composure. "Sorry for the interruption," he began, "but I believe a girl on this flight is in danger. She confirmed to me that she is being held against her will. We need to alert the police at the destination." The captain, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, looked at him intently before responding. "Are you sure about this?" the pilot asked, visibly concerned. David nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. The girl made distress signals and confirmed to me she is in danger. The man with her does not seem trustworthy." The pilot exchanged a quick look with the co-pilot before responding. "We will contact the police at New York Airport. We will inform them of the situation so they are prepared when we land." David felt a wave of relief. He had taken an important step to help Emily, but he knew it wasn't over yet. He had to ensure the girl was safe until they reached their destination. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I will return to my seat, but I will be vigilant for anything that might happen." The pilot nodded, and David left the cockpit, closing the door behind him. He walked back to his seat, making sure to pass by Emily and the man. As he passed, he noticed that Emily was still looking around, clearly nervous but trying to stay calm. David gave her a small nod, trying to convey that he was doing everything possible to help her. Back in his seat, David sat down and took a deep breath. He kept his attention on Emily and the man, watching for any suspicious movements. The man seemed increasingly restless, but still didn't notice David's attention. Time seemed to pass slowly. Every minute felt like an eternity as the plane flew through the skies. David was tense, ready to act if necessary. His mind went over the plan repeatedly to ensure Emily's safety until they arrived in New York. The Pacific Airlines flight had been relatively calm until that point. Passengers began to relax, some sleeping, others watching movies on the small screens in front of them. David, however, could not afford to relax. His eyes remained fixed on Emily and the man accompanying her. He felt that every passing minute increased the tension. Suddenly, the plane began to shake. The lights flickered, and a calm but firm voice came over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are entering a turbulence zone. Please remain seated and fasten your seat belts." David felt the change in the atmosphere of the plane. Passengers began to murmur to each other, some showing clear signs of nervousness. The turbulence intensified, shaking the aircraft strongly. Suitcases in the overhead compartments began to move, and a few surprised screams filled the air. David knew this was his chance. The distraction of the storm could give him the margin he needed to act without being immediately detected. He unbuckled his seatbelt with trembling hands and stood up. He walked quickly down the aisle towards where Emily was, keeping his head low to avoid attracting the man's attention. "Emily, come with me," David said, trying to keep his voice firm and calm despite the chaos around them. Emily looked at him with wide eyes, filled with fear, but also trust. She stood up quickly, and at that moment the man accompanying her grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going?" he said in a harsh voice. David didn't have time to argue. With a swift and decisive movement, he grabbed Emily and pulled her towards him. "Let's go," he exclaimed. The turbulence caused the man to stumble, losing his balance. David took advantage of the moment to lead Emily towards the front of the plane. The passengers were too busy trying to stay in control amidst the chaos to notice what was happening. They reached the cockpit door. David knocked hard, hoping someone would respond quickly. The door opened slightly, and the co-pilot peeked out with an alarmed expression. "What's happening here?" asked the co-pilot, trying to stay calm. "This girl is in danger," David said urgently. "We need your help. The man she's with is not her father. We need to alert the authorities on the ground immediately." The co-pilot looked at Emily, who nodded timidly, confirming David's words. Without wasting any time, the co-pilot opened the door completely and let them in. "Sit down and stay calm," he ordered while communicating with the pilot. "We're going to contact air traffic control and alert the police in New York." David and Emily sat in a corner of the cockpit, trying to stay calm as the plane continued to shake violently. David could hear the pilot talking on the radio, informing about the situation and requesting immediate assistance upon arrival. "Air traffic control, this is Pacific Airlines Flight 739. We have an emergency situation on board. A girl is being held against her will. We request police presence upon landing," said the pilot firmly. Air traffic control responded quickly, assuring that the police would be ready to intervene as soon as they landed. David felt a wave of relief, but knew they still had to get through the storm and arrive safely in New York. The turbulence continued, and David could see through the cockpit windows how dark clouds surrounded the plane. The storm was intense, and the sound of thunder and the flash of lightning created an atmosphere of extreme tension. Emily clung to his arm, her eyes tightly closed. "Everything will be fine," David whispered to her, trying to calm her. "We're almost there." The pilot made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe turbulence. Please remain calm and follow the flight crew's instructions." The pilot's voice, though calm, reflected the gravity of the situation. David could feel the tension in the air, but his determination to protect Emily did not waver. He knew they needed to stay strong a little longer. The plane continued its descent towards New York, and David knew that every minute counted. From the cockpit, he could see the man accompanying Emily getting increasingly nervous. His eyes scanned the plane in desperation, realizing the girl had disappeared. David knew it wouldn't be long before he started actively searching. "Emily, we need to move quickly," David said in an urgent whisper. "We need to find a safe place until we land." Emily nodded, her large eyes reflecting as much fear as determination. David took her hand, and they left the cockpit, moving quickly and discreetly down the narrow aisle of the plane. The passengers, still recovering from the turbulence, barely noticed their passage. The man began moving from his seat, walking down the aisle and looking frantically around. David watched him from a distance, knowing he had to act quickly before the man found them. His years on the street had taught him to think quickly and act decisively in critical situations. With Emily by his side, David slid to the back of the plane, where the door to the luggage compartment was located. He looked around, making sure no one was watching, and carefully opened the door. "Get in, quickly," he instructed Emily. The girl obeyed without hesitation, and David followed her, closing the door behind them. The luggage compartment was dark and narrow, but it offered the temporary refuge they needed. "Listen, Emily," David said, as he knelt to her level. "We have to stay here until we land. The pilots have already alerted the police. They will be waiting for us at the airport." Emily nodded, clinging to David's arm. Her trust in him was evident, giving David the strength he needed to stay firm. He knew they couldn't let their guard down, but at least they were one step closer to safety. The sound of the engines and the faint hum of passenger conversations filled the space. David remained alert, listening for any sign that the man might be approaching. He knew that although the luggage compartment wasn't a perfect hiding spot, it gave them a crucial advantage in those final moments of the flight. The minutes passed exasperatingly slowly. Every sound, every movement made David tense his muscles, ready to protect Emily. He thought about the steps that had brought them there, from the girl's first anxious look to the storm that had given them the opportunity to act. It all seemed part of a chaotic and desperate but necessary plan. The plane began its descent towards JFK Airport in New York. The seatbelt lights came on, and an authoritative voice from the pilot resonated in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to land. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The police will be waiting at the airport, due to an emergency situation on board." David, with nerves on edge, turned to Emily. Her little face was pale, but her eyes showed a resolution that deeply moved him. "Emily, listen carefully," he said in a low voice. "You need to stay here, hidden in the luggage compartment. Don't make any noise, and don't come out until it's safe. Do you understand?" Emily nodded firmly, pressing her lips to hold back tears. David gave her one last, reassuring look before closing the compartment and ensuring she was well hidden. He took a deep breath, knowing the moment of truth was about to arrive. The plane continued its descent, and David cautiously left the compartment, moving down the aisle with determination. His eyes searched for the man, and it didn't take long to find him. He was nervously moving between the seats, clearly looking for Emily. The expression on his face was a mix of anger and desperation. David approached him, his heart pounding in his chest. He stopped at a prudent distance, enough not to raise immediate suspicion. "Where is the girl?" the man demanded in a cold and threatening voice. David stood firm, not averting his gaze. "She's safe. The police will be here any moment. It's better if you surrender now." The man let out a frustrated growl and advanced towards David with surprising speed. He tried to hit him, but David, with reflexes sharpened by years of surviving on the streets, ducked and dodged the attack. He quickly stood up and used the man's momentum against him, pushing him into an empty seat. The commotion of the confrontation attracted the attention of several passengers who began to watch with growing interest and concern. David knew he had to act quickly to prevent the situation from getting further out of control. The man got up, staggering, his face contorted with rage. He threw another punch, but David blocked it with his forearm and, with a quick movement, pushed him into the aisle of the plane. The man fell to the floor, hitting his head on an armrest. "Help!" David shouted to the passengers, pointing at the fallen man. "He's dangerous! We need to stop him!" The passengers, initially surprised, began to move. A burly man stood up and approached quickly, followed by two women who seemed determined to help. Together they managed to immobilize the man, holding him against the floor while David looked for something to tie him with. A flight attendant appeared at that moment, her face a mix of fear and determination. "Here," she said, handing David an emergency rope. With the help of the passengers, David managed to tie the man's hands behind his back. The man struggled, but his resistance quickly diminished as he realized he was surrounded and had no escape. The plane began to level out, preparing for landing. The passengers returned to their seats, though many continued to look anxiously at the immobilized man in the aisle. David knelt beside him, ensuring the restraints were secure. "The police will be here in a few minutes," he said in a low but firm voice. "Your game is over." The man gave him a furious look, but said nothing. His eyes revealed a mix of frustration and defeat. The plane landed smoothly on the runway at JFK Airport in New York. The passengers, still nervous from the recent events, began to relax as the plane decelerated and headed towards the gate. The blue and red emergency lights flashed outside the windows, a clear sign that the police were ready to intervene. "Please remain seated until the authorities board the plane," announced the pilot over the intercom, his voice firm and calm. David, with Emily by his side, watched out the window with a mix of relief and anticipation. He knew the critical moment was approaching, but felt a new tranquility, knowing help was so close. Emily, though visibly tired, maintained a look of resolution on her face. The plane's doors opened, and several police officers quickly entered, moving with precision and determination. David raised his hand to catch their attention. "Here," he said loudly. "This is the man you're looking for." The officers headed towards the man tied up in the aisle. One of them, a stern-looking detective, knelt to speak with the man. "Name?" asked the detective, his voice firm and uncompromising. The man remained silent, his look defiant. The officers lifted him and began to escort him towards the exit of the plane. As they escorted him, one of the police officers received a call on his radio. He nodded and looked at his colleagues. "He's a wanted terrorist. They confirmed it with his fingerprint. He's on the most wanted list." A murmur of surprise and fear ran through the plane. The passengers, who had remained relatively calm, began to speak in low voices, processing the gravity of the situation. David turned to Emily and smiled softly at her. Let's go. Let's find your mother, he said, gently taking her hand. They walked together towards the exit of the plane, closely followed by a couple of officers, ensuring they arrived safely. As they descended the steps, Emily looked around, searching for a familiar face among the crowd. And there she was, a woman with tear-filled eyes and an indescribable look of relief. She ran towards Emily and enveloped her in a tight hug, her sobs of joy mingling with words of thanks. "Emily, my love, I was so worried," the woman said, stroking her daughter's hair. "Thank God you're safe." David watched the scene with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had fulfilled his mission and could now see the result of his effort. Emily's mother looked up and gazed at him with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough," she said, extending a trembling hand. David shook her hand with a smile. "I just did what I had to do. I'm glad to see Emily is safe." The police escorted them to a private waiting room where they could sit and rest after the tumultuous flight. An officer approached David with a notebook in hand. "We need to take your statement about what happened, sir," the officer began. "David. Just David," he replied, nodding. "Of course, I'm willing to cooperate." While David recounted the events that had occurred, Emily and her mother hugged, speaking softly and comforting each other. David noticed the deep connection between them and felt a pang of nostalgia for what he once had and lost. When he finished his statement, the officer shook his hand. "Thank you for your bravery, David. You've saved a life today." David nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who had done the right thing at a crucial moment. Emily's mother approached again, this time with a calmer but still grateful expression. "David, we don't have anyone in New York. Would you mind accompanying us to the hotel? It would make us feel much safer." David looked at Emily, who gazed at him with hopeful eyes. He nodded slowly. "Sure, I'd be happy to help. Let's go." They left the airport together, followed by a police car escorting them. The city of New York, with its bright lights and incessant energy, unfolded before them. For Emily and her mother, it was the beginning of a new stage, full of hope and safety. For David, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always an opportunity to do good and make a difference. As the car moved through the city streets, David knew his life was also about to change in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. But he was ready to face whatever came, with the satisfaction of having done the right thing and the promise of new opportunities on the horizon. The sun began to rise over the horizon of New York, illuminating the streets with a golden light, announcing a new day. David sat in the hotel lobby, where Emily and her mother were staying, waiting on a comfortable leather armchair. A few days had passed since the incident on the plane, but the events were still fresh in his mind. Emily ran down the hotel stairs with her usual renewed energy and a smile that lit up the room. Her mother, Clara, followed closely, with an expression of gratitude and serenity on her face. "David!" exclaimed Emily as she ran towards him and hugged him. "Are we going to have breakfast together?" David smiled and nodded, his heart feeling lighter every time he saw the girl happy and safe. "Of course, Emily. Let's have breakfast," he replied, standing up from the armchair. Clara approached them, and after a brief moment of silence, she looked at David with a seriousness that contrasted with Emily's joy. "David, there's something we want to propose to you," Clara said warmly, motioning for him to take a seat once more. "Since what happened on the plane, I can't stop thinking about how brave and determined you were to save Emily. My husband and I have discussed it at length, and we believe you would be an incredible addition to our family. We'd like to offer you a position here at our home as our head of security." David was momentarily speechless. For so many years, he had navigated life on the streets without a stable home or a family to call his own. Clara's unexpected offer touched him deeply. I don't know what to say," David finally managed, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and gratitude. "I'm truly grateful for the opportunity. I would love to accept." Clara smiled warmly, a sense of relief evident in her expression. "Thank you, David. With your experience and character, we trust that Emily will be safe, and so will we. And we want you to know that you're not just an employee to us. You're part of our family, someone we deeply respect and appreciate." Emily, who had been listening attentively, jumped with joy. "David is going to live with us," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "This is wonderful news." Her words wrapped David in a comforting embrace of belonging that he had sorely missed for years. It marked the dawn of a new chapter, a chance to reset his life among those who cherished and supported him. The days that followed were a flurry of activity. David settled into Clara's spacious home, nestled in a tranquil and secure neighborhood. The house, with its ample rooms and inviting ambiance, boasted a sprawling garden where Emily had spent countless playful hours. Clara and her husband took great care in showing David around, ensuring he lacked nothing. David approached his new job with eager determination. His initial task involved enhancing the home's security measures, a responsibility he embraced with his street-honed vigilance and caution. These skills, forged through adversity, now safeguarded his newfound family, providing peace of mind to everyone under their roof. Every morning, Emily waited for him in the kitchen to have breakfast together before going to school. Clara joined them, and those everyday moments became David's favorite part of the day. He felt a peace and happiness he hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, while walking in the garden, Emily took David's hand and looked at him with her big blue eyes. "David, why did you live on the streets before meeting us?" she asked with the innocence and curiosity of a child. David stopped and thought for a moment before answering. "Life sometimes takes us down difficult paths, Emily. But what's important is not to give up and keep moving forward. Meeting your mother and you has given me a new opportunity, and I'm very grateful for it." Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. David savored Emily's heartfelt words as they resonated within him. "I'm glad you're with us, David. You're like a hero to me," she had said, and those words became a source of strength for him. He knew that true heroism wasn't defined by grand gestures alone, but by the daily commitment to nurture and protect those we cherish. Each morning brought a new sense of purpose as David witnessed Emily's joy and safety. His role in Clara's home evolved beyond being the vigilant guardian. He became an integral part of their lives, a trusted friend to Emily, a mentor guiding her through life's challenges, and a steadfast support for Clara and her husband. David's presence transformed the atmosphere of Clara's home. It was now a sanctuary filled with trust, warmth, and mutual respect. The days of loneliness and despair on the streets felt distant as he embraced the love and appreciation of his newfound family. His journey had come full circle, from the solitude of homelessness to the embrace of a loving family, where his contributions were valued and his presence cherished. David knew that he had found his place in the world, where his past struggles had paved the way for a future filled with meaning and fulfillment. As we reach the end of our story, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each of you for accompanying me on this journey. It's been a pleasure sharing these moments together, exploring new ideas and experiences. Remember, life is a series of stories waiting to be told, and each one enriches our understanding of the world and ourselves. Whether it's through tales of bravery, love, or discovery, each narrative shapes us in unique ways. If you've enjoyed our time together, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and staying tuned for more enriching content. Your support means the world to me, and I look forward to sharing more stories and experiences with you soon. Until we meet again, may your days be filled with wonder, joy, and endless possibilities. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and here's to the next chapter in our adventure together.